The last Roman eagles withdraw from Britain in the year 410, their bronze wings glinting one final time in the pale northern sun, before vanishing beyond the horizon like dreams at dawn. Behind them, they leave a land caught between worlds, no longer Roman, not yet English, suspended in that dangerous twilight where legends are born from the ashes of empires. At Lullingstone Villa, Christian mosaics gather dust, while weeds push through marble floors that once hosted feasts where Latin poetry flowed like wine. Across Britain, similar scenes of abandonment tell the same story. The collapse of a civilization that had endured for nearly 4 centuries. Without Rome's legions to hold the frontiers, without imperial bureaucracy to collect taxes and maintain order, the island fragments into a dozen petty kingdoms, ruled by men who remember Roman law, but lack Roman strength. Yet at Tintagel, perched on Cornwall's savage coast, Mediterranean pottery shards mingle with local Celtic artifacts. Someone ruling this windswept fortress still commands trade routes stretching from Ireland to Constantinople. The great hill fort of Cadbury Castle in Somerset shows signs of massive refortification during the 5th century. Someone with considerable resources and vision was preparing for war on a scale that required moving mountains of earth and stone. The Saxon tide rolls inexorably westward from their landing places in Kent and Sussex. These are not mere raiders seeking quick plunder, but entire peoples, men, women, children, livestock, household gods, crossing the Whale Road to claim permanent homes in British soil. They bring with them strange customs, harsh tongues, and a warrior culture that measures honor in battle scars and values loyalty above life itself. Gildas, a British monk writing in the 6th century, describes the Saxon advance with the anguish of a man watching his world burn. The fire of vengeance spread from sea to sea and licked the Western Ocean with its red and savage tongue. His words carry the raw terror of those who witnessed Germanic axes splitting Romano-British skulls, of Saxon flames consuming libraries where Virgil's verses had echoed for generations. Yet Gildas also mentions victories, moments when British courage turned the tide and drove the invaders back to their ships. He speaks of Ambrosius Aurelianus, last of the Romans, who rallied the scattered kingdoms and restored hope when all seemed lost. This Ambrosius becomes, in later centuries, Arthur's predecessor and sometimes his kinsman, the bridge between Roman order and Celtic heroism. The Annales Cambriae, compiled in Welsh monasteries generations after the events they describe, preserve brief entries that pierce the mists of legend like sudden shafts of sunlight. Under the year 516, a laconic scribe records the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were the victors. These few words, scratched onto parchment in a monastery cell, represent our earliest written evidence for the war leader's existence. No king yet, merely a commander whose greatest triumph involved carrying Christian symbols into battle against pagan enemies. The detail about 3 days and nights suggests a prolonged siege or a series of connected engagements, exactly the kind of grinding warfare that characterized this period of British resistance. The Historia Brittonum, attributed to the Welsh monk Nennius, expands the record with tantalizing details. The Dux Bellorum fights 12 battles against the Saxons, culminating in Badon Hill, where Arthur slew 960 men in one charge, and no one struck them down except Arthur himself. The numbers reek of legend rather than history, yet the core narrative rings true. A British commander who won a decisive victory that halted Saxon expansion for a generation. 3 historical figures emerge from the shadows as possible inspiration for the legend that will consume medieval Europe. Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman cavalry commander of Sarmatian origin, led expeditions into Scotland during the 2nd century. Too early for the legendary king, yet his name and military reputation may have echoed through oral tradition. The heavy cavalry tactics of his Sarmatian horsemen, armoured riders thundering across battlefields with long lances, prefigure the knightly warfare that will define Arthurian romance. Riothamus, Supreme King or High King, appears in continental sources, leading a British army into Gaul during the 470s, fighting alongside Romans against barbarian invasions before disappearing into the forests of Burgundy. His name, his royal title, and his mysterious fate create intriguing parallels with the hero of later legend, a king who conquers foreign lands before meeting catastrophe far from home. Yet it is Ambrosius Aurelianus who fits most closely with the historical figure preserved in early sources. Gildas describes him as a Roman gentleman whose parents had worn the purple, suggesting imperial connections, who organized British resistance after a period of devastating defeat. Some sources make the future king his successor, others his lieutenant, but all agree that the victory at Baden Hill represents the climax of the resistance that Ambrosius began. Somewhere in Britain, probably between 490 and 516 AD, a battle was fought that changed the course of European history. The Saxons, drunk on decades of easy victories, confident in their destiny to claim all of Britain as their Germanic ancestors, had claimed the ruins of Rome's other provinces, marched into a trap that would shatter their momentum for 2 generations. The battlefield might have been Liddington Hill in Wiltshire, with its commanding views across the Thames Valley. Perhaps it was Badbury Rings in Dorset, where ancient earthworks could shelter defending forces while channeling attackers into killing zones. The location matters less than the result. For the first time since the Saxon invasions began, British resistance achieved complete victory over their seemingly invincible enemies. Contemporary sources suggest the battle lasted 3 days, indicating either a prolonged siege or a series of connected engagements. Archaeological evidence from the period shows that Romano-British forces had adapted their tactics to match changing conditions, abandoning the rigid infantry formations of classical Rome in favor of more flexible cavalry units supported by local militia. Against Saxon shield walls, heavy horsemen armed with long spears would have possessed devastating advantages, provided they had leadership capable of coordinating such complex operations. The supreme war leader emerges from this context not as a king in the medieval sense, but as a dux bellorum, a commander whose authority derived from military success rather than hereditary right. His followers would have included Romano-British cavalry, Celtic warriors seeking glory and plunder, Christian soldiers fighting a holy war against pagan invaders, and perhaps even foreign mercenaries attracted by his reputation for victory. The aftermath of Baden suggests that this victory was both military and political. The Saxons not only retreated from their advanced positions, but ceased their expansion entirely, consolidating their hold on territories already conquered while abandoning ambitions for further conquest. For nearly 50 years after Baden, the historical record shows relative peace between Britons and Saxons. This Arthurian peace represents one of the last successful defenses of Romano-British civilization against barbarian conquest, buying precious time for Christian culture to consolidate. Long before Christian scribes recorded victories over Saxon pagans, Celtic storytellers were weaving tales around figures whose exploits transcended mortal limitations. In the misty realm of Welsh tradition, the legendary war chief appears not as a historical king, but as a supernatural hero whose adventures take him to the very edges of the world. The tale of Culhwch and Olwen, preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts but rooted in much older oral tradition, presents a figure who commands not just warriors, but giants, shapeshifters, and magical beasts. His court includes men who can hear ants stirring 50 miles away, who can drink entire seas dry, who can grow so tall their heads pierce the clouds. This is the Celtic wonder-tale hero, more akin to the Irish Finn McCool than to any historical war leader. Yet even in these fantastic adventures, certain elements persist that will echo through all later versions of the legend. The hero's hall welcomes all worthy warriors, regardless of birth or origin. His justice extends protection to the weak and innocent. His generosity makes him the most sought-after patron in the Celtic world. These ideals, hospitality, justice, generosity, form the moral foundation upon which medieval romance will build its elaborate codes of chivalry. The Welsh figure also carries darker resonances that Christian tradition will struggle to suppress. He raids the otherworld fortress of Annwn to steal a magical cauldron that never empties, a deed that costs him all but 7 of his companions and prefigures, both the Grail quest and the catastrophic losses that will mark his legend's end. He fights giants who are older than human memory, battles monsters that represent primal chaos, and commands a sword whose Welsh name, Caladfwlch, will eventually become Excalibur. Celtic tradition preserves memories that stretch beyond Britain's shores. Breton storytellers, descended from refugees who fled Saxon invasion, carry tales of the great king into continental Europe, where they will merge with French romance and transform European literature. In their stories, he becomes Arthur le Grand, a figure of such immense reputation that his very name commands respect from Ireland to Jerusalem. The Druids, though officially suppressed by Roman law and Christian doctrine, maintained underground traditions that shaped how Celtic peoples understood kingship and heroism. Their concept of the sacred king, a ruler whose spiritual health directly affected the land's fertility, infuses Arthurian legend with mystical elements that no amount of Christian reinterpretation can entirely eliminate. The wounded fisher king, the wasteland that reflects royal failure, the magical sword that chooses the rightful ruler, all derive from pre-Christian Celtic beliefs about the mystical connection between king and kingdom. Celtic mythology also contributes the concept of the hero's tragic destiny. In Irish and Welsh tradition, the greatest warriors are marked from birth for eventual doom, their very excellence ensuring their destruction. Cuchulain's battle fury makes him invincible, but also isolates him from human fellowship. The Fianna's perfection as a warrior band contains the seeds of its own dissolution. The Arthurian legend will inherit this tragic pattern, transforming a historical victory into an eternal cycle of rise, triumph, and inevitable fall. The transformation from history to legend begins almost immediately. Welsh bards, accustomed to celebrating their patron's deeds in verses that stretch truth like beaten gold, found in the British War chief a subject worthy of their most extravagant praise. His victory over the Saxons became a victory over all enemies of British freedom. His cavalry charge at Baden became a supernatural assault that slaughtered hundreds with supernatural ease. His war leadership became perfect kingship that united all the fractured British kingdoms under a single crown. The geographical distribution of early Arthurian sites suggests historical foundations for the legend. From Cornwall to Scotland, ancient monuments acquire Arthurian associations during the medieval period, but the densest concentration appears in the western regions, where British resistance lasted longest against Saxon expansion. Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh, Caerleon in Wales, Tintagel in Cornwall. These places preserve cultural memories of the historical period when British war leaders still commanded resources and loyalty sufficient to challenge foreign conquest. Archaeological investigation reveals fascinating parallels with the historical context of late 5th century Britain. Tintagel shows evidence of high-status occupation during the exact period when the historical war leader would have lived. Mediterranean pottery, wine amphorae, and luxury goods suggest that whoever ruled this remote Cornish fortress commanded trade networks stretching across Europe, exactly the kind of international connections that a successful commander might have maintained. Cadbury Castle, identified by local tradition as the future king's Camelot since at least the 16th century, underwent massive refortification during the late 5th century. The scale of these works, involving the construction of new walls, gates, and interior buildings, suggests a ruler with access to considerable manpower and resources. Carbon dating places this construction in the precise period when the historical figure would have been organizing British resistance against Saxon expansion. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth takes up his pen in the 12th century, the legendary king has already completed his journey from war leader to folk hero. The raw materials of legend lie ready for literary transformation. A historical figure whose achievements saved a civilization, a body of oral tradition that has already elevated him beyond mortal limitations, and a cultural context that values both martial excellence and moral perfection. The mists of Avalon are gathering around the historical war chief, obscuring the man while revealing the eternal symbol he is destined to become. In those mists, a dozen centuries of dreamers will glimpse their highest hopes for what leadership might achieve, what fellowship might accomplish, and what sacrifice might ultimately mean. The once and future king stirs in his sleep, preparing for the literary awakening that will make him immortal. In the scriptorium of Oxford, sometime around 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth dips his quill into ink and begins to write the most influential lie in European literature. His Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain, will transform a half-remembered war leader into the greatest monarch who never lived, launching 1,000 years of dreams about what kingship might become when guided by divine will and human nobility. The Welsh cleric writes in a world still reeling from conquest. 66 years have passed since William the Conqueror's Norman knights shattered Harold Godwinson's shield wall at Hastings, replacing Anglo-Saxon England with a French-speaking aristocracy that regards their new subjects as barely civilized barbarians. The Normans bring efficient administration, stone castles, and ruthless ambition, but they lack the one thing that medieval kingship requires above all else: legitimacy rooted in the sacred soil of the realm they now rule. This is the crisis that inspires the Oxford scholar's masterpiece of creative history. If the Norman kings need ancient precedent for their rule over Britain, the chronicler will provide them with a past so glorious that even conquest by descendants of Charlemagne pales beside it. If they require proof that this island has always been destined for greatness, he will give them a king who conquered Rome itself. If they seek a model for Christian monarchy that combines military prowess with spiritual authority, the Welsh monk will resurrect the war leader of Baden Hill and crown him emperor of half the world. The Historia opens not with the familiar figure of the historical commander, but with an entirely new mythology that traces British royal lineage back to the survivors of Troy. Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas, leads his refugee band across the Mediterranean and through Gaul, before landing on Britain's white cliffs to establish New Troy, the city that will become London. This Trojan origin immediately elevates British kingship to the same legendary status as Roman imperial claims, creating a fictional genealogy that rivals anything the Normans can offer. Through 11 centuries of imagined history, the chronicle builds toward the climax that has always been its true purpose, the reign of the greatest British king. But this monarch bears only passing resemblance to the Dux Bellorum, who carried Christian symbols into battle against Saxon raiders. The figure who emerges from the Welsh imagination transcends the boundaries of post-Roman Britain to become a world-conquering emperor whose achievements dwarf those of Alexander or Caesar. The transformation begins with the circumstances of conception itself. Where earlier sources offer no details about origins, the Oxford cleric provides a tale of supernatural intervention that immediately marks his hero as chosen by divine providence. Uther Pendragon, High King of Britain, burns with hopeless passion for Igraine, wife of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall. Their desire threatens to tear the realm apart in civil war, until the wizard Merlin offers a solution that will echo through centuries of romance. Magical disguise that allows love to triumph over law. On a storm-lashed night at Tintagel, Merlin's arts transform Uther into the perfect likeness of Gorlois, enabling him to enter the castle and lie with Igraine, while her true husband dies fighting Uther's forces on a distant battlefield. The timing is precise, the magic flawless, the result inevitable. A child conceived in supernatural circumstances, born of passion and shaped by prophecy, destined to become the greatest king in British history. This magical conception elevates the future monarch far above ordinary royal birth. Like Jesus of Nazareth, he enters the world through divine intervention that bypasses normal biological laws. Like heroes of classical mythology, his origins combine mortal parentage with supernatural power. The very circumstances of his birth proclaim that this child will transcend the limitations that constrain ordinary rulers, achieving greatness that reflects divine will rather than merely human ambition. Yet the cleric's genius lies not simply in creating supernatural origins, but in grounding them within a coherent political and spiritual framework that addresses the needs of 12th century monarchy. The magical conception serves multiple narrative purposes. It explains the extraordinary abilities the future king will display, justifies the absolute loyalty he commands from his followers, and provides religious sanction for his eventual conquests. Divine intervention in royal conception becomes a metaphor for divine sanction of royal authority. Uther's early death leaves the infant prince orphaned and vulnerable, hidden away by Merlin's wisdom until the moment comes for his identity to be revealed. This period of concealment serves both dramatic and political purposes within the narrative structure. Dramatically, it creates the foundation for the sword in the stone episode that will prove the young man's rightful claim to the throne. Politically, it suggests that true kingship transcends the accidents of birth and upbringing, manifesting itself through divine signs that no human authority can counterfeit. The famous scene of the sword embedded in stone arrives at precisely the moment when Britain needs it most urgently. With Uther dead and no acknowledged heir apparent, the realm fragments into chaos as ambitious nobles wage private wars for regional dominance. The Archbishop of Canterbury, guided by Merlin's counsel, summons all the warriors of Britain to London for a great tournament where God will reveal the rightful king through miraculous sign. In the chronicler's telling, the sword appears embedded in a great stone before the principal church of London, bearing an inscription that promises the crown to whoever can draw it forth. Every knight in Britain attempts the feat, from the most powerful earls to the humblest knight's bachelor. but the blade remains immovable as the stone that holds it. The message is clear. Divine will, not human strength, determines royal legitimacy. When the unknown youth approaches the stone, he does so not in prideful ambition, but in innocent service. Attending his foster brother, Kay, at the tournament, he seeks only to replace a forgotten sword with this convenient substitute. The blade slides from the stone as easily as from a well-oiled scabbard, revealing in that instant the true nature of Christian kingship. Power that flows not from violence or cunning, but from spiritual worthiness that God recognizes even when humanity remains blind. This miraculous selection establishes principles that will govern the entire reign. The new king rules not by conquest or inheritance, but by divine appointment manifest through supernatural signs. His authority derives not from the support of nobles or the acclaim of armies, but from the will of God expressed through miraculous intervention. Such a ruler can demand absolute obedience because his commands carry divine sanction, yet he must also exercise power according to divine law, because his legitimacy depends entirely on spiritual worthiness. The coronation that follows represents Geoffrey's vision of perfect Christian monarchy in action. The young king receives not merely the crown and scepter of temporal authority, but spiritual consecration that transforms him from noble warrior into sacred ruler. The ceremony combines Roman imperial symbolism, Christian religious ritual, and Celtic traditions of kingship, creating a model of royal inauguration that suggests the harmony possible when divine will guides human institutions. Yet the Welsh writer understands that medieval audiences demand more than spiritual perfection from their ideal king. They expect military prowess, political wisdom, and the ability to defend the realm against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. The newly crowned monarch must prove his worthiness through deeds that match the miraculous circumstances of his selection, demonstrating that divine favor translates into practical success in governing fractious nobles and defeating hostile invaders. The early military campaigns serve this narrative purpose perfectly. Saxon raiders who have terrorized the eastern counties discover that the new king wages war with supernatural effectiveness. His cavalry charges scatter enemy formations like leaves before autumn storms. His strategic vision anticipates enemy movements with prophetic accuracy. His personal courage inspires followers to feats of heroism that transform desperate battles into overwhelming victories. But the chronicler's vision extends far beyond the defensive warfare that characterized the historical period, where the real war leader fought to preserve Romano-British civilization within its existing boundaries. The literary king embarks on campaigns of conquest that carry British arms across the known world. Ireland falls to his forces within months of his coronation. Scotland submits after a series of brilliant campaigns that demonstrate both tactical genius and merciful treatment of defeated enemies. These preliminary conquests establish the pattern that will define the entire reign. Military success that serves moral purposes rather than mere territorial ambition. Each victory extends Christian civilization into regions previously dominated by pagan barbarism. Each conquest brings justice to lands previously governed by tyranny and chaos. Each new territory added to the growing empire represents a triumph of divine order over demonic confusion. The expansion beyond the British Isles elevates the narrative from regional chronicle to imperial epic. Norwegian kings who have terrorized the northern seas surrender their fleets and swear fealty. Danish jarls who have raided Christian monasteries for generations convert to the true faith and offer their axes in service to the British crown. Even the proud French nobles who trace their lineage back to Charlemagne acknowledge the superior claims of this British emperor, whose achievements surpass those of any continental ruler. The Oxford scholar's account of the Gallic campaigns reveals his sophisticated understanding of contemporary European politics. Writing in an age when Norman kings rule both England and substantial territories in France, he creates a fictional precedent for cross-channel empire that makes current political arrangements seem like the restoration of ancient glories rather than the result of recent conquest. The literary king's victories in Gaul provide historical justification for Norman claims to French territories, while simultaneously elevating British prestige above its continental rivals. The climax of these conquests comes with the challenge to Rome itself, where the historical war leader defended the last remnants of Roman civilization in Britain. Geoffrey's emperor carries war to the very heart of the empire that once ruled the world. The symbolic reversal is complete. Britain, which once received law from Rome, now imposes its will upon the eternal city. The barbarian island that classical authors dismissed as lying beyond the bounds of civilization now stands revealed as the source of a new imperial order destined to surpass all previous achievements. This confrontation with Rome serves multiple purposes within the overall narrative structure. Dramatically, it represents the ultimate test of the British king's worthiness, pitting him against the most prestigious military and political power in medieval imagination. Politically, it suggests that Christian monarchy, guided by divine will, can achieve victories that surpass those of any previous empire. Spiritually, it implies that Britain has inherited Rome's imperial destiny, becoming the new center of world civilization under divine providence. The emperor who marches on Rome bears little resemblance to the war leader who fought desperately to preserve British independence against Saxon conquest. This literary creation transcends the limitations of historical reality to become a symbol of what kingship might achieve when guided by divine will and exercised according to Christian principles. His conquests represent not the brutal expansion of one power at the expense of others, but the triumph of universal values that benefit all humanity. Yet even as the chronicler elevates his hero to heights of achievement that no historical ruler could match, he begins to plant the seeds of the tragedy that will ultimately destroy everything the great king has built. The very perfection of the empire creates the conditions for its dissolution. The absolute loyalty that enables such spectacular conquests also generates the pride and ambition that will tear the realm apart. The magical elements that mark divine favor in the king's rise will manifest as supernatural doom in his fall. Merlin, the wizard whose power enabled Uther's deception and guided the young king's early triumphs, begins to withdraw from active involvement in human affairs. His prophecies, which once promised unlimited success, now carry undertones of approaching catastrophe. The supernatural forces that lifted one man to unprecedented heights of achievement are already preparing to cast him down in fulfillment of the tragic destiny that awaits all heroes who dare to reach beyond mortal limitations. The introduction of Mordred into the narrative provides the human agency through which this tragic destiny will unfold. In the chronicler's version, he remains a nephew rather than the illegitimate son of later romance, but his function is already clear. He represents the principle of betrayal that corrupts even the most perfect institutions. His presence in the court reminds readers that human nature contains the seeds of its own destruction, that even divinely appointed kingship cannot permanently overcome the flaws that mar all earthly achievements. As the Historia moves toward its climactic confrontations, the Welsh monk has accomplished his revolutionary transformation of Arthurian material. The half-remembered war leader who won a single decisive battle against Saxon invaders has become an emperor whose conquests span 3 continents. The Dux Bellorum, who fought to preserve the remnants of Romano-British civilization, has become a world conqueror whose achievements dwarf those of Alexander, Caesar, and Charlemagne combined. This literary metamorphosis will prove more durable than any historical monument. The chronicler's vision of the perfect Christian king will inspire centuries of romance writers, providing the foundation for elaborate codes of chivalry and courtly behavior that shape European aristocratic culture. His model of monarchy, guided by divine will and exercised according to spiritual principles, will influence actual kings who seek to transform this fiction into political reality. The chronicle ends where it began, with the promise of return. The wounded emperor departs for Avalon, neither dead nor fully alive, awaiting the moment when Britain will need his presence once again. This ambiguous conclusion ensures that Geoffrey's creation will continue to evolve, inspiring new generations of storytellers to explore the implications of perfect kingship and the tragic fate that awaits all human achievements, however noble their origins or divine their sanction. The Welsh cleric lays down his quill, satisfied that he has given medieval Europe the king it needs even if it never existed. The ink dries on parchment that will launch 1,000 ships of imagination, carrying the Arthurian legend far beyond the shores of the Britain where it began. In scriptoriums across Europe, scribes will copy these words, spreading the vision of the once and future king to every corner of Christendom. The making of a king is complete. Now begins the making of a legend that will outlast the kingdoms that inspired it. The ink has barely dried on the Welsh chronicler's masterpiece when new voices take up the tale, transforming the world-conquering emperor into something even more revolutionary. The perfect Christian king who rules not through conquest alone, but through the revolutionary ideals of fellowship, justice, and sacred brotherhood. In the courts of 12th century Europe, where troubadours sing of love and poets dream of honor, the literary monarch discovers his true destiny, not as a conqueror of nations, but as the creator of a new form of kingship that will inspire 1,000 years of longing for what leadership might become. Master Wace, writing in the Norman court around 1155, receives a commission that will change European literature forever. King Henry II, great-grandson of William the Conqueror and ruler of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, commands his court poet to translate the Latin chronicle into French verse that his warriors can understand and his ladies can appreciate. What emerges from Wace's workshop transcends mere translation to become a new vision of monarchy, perfectly suited to an age discovering the possibilities of courtly refinement. The Roman de Brute introduces an innovation that will prove more influential than all the emperor's fictional conquests: the Round Table itself. Where the earlier chronicle spoke only of a great king who commanded loyal followers, the Norman poet creates an institution that embodies revolutionary principles of warrior equality and sacred fellowship. At this circular board, no seat takes precedence over any other. The greatest champions in the world gather as brothers in arms, united not by feudal obligation, but by shared commitment to ideals that transcend the ordinary bonds between lord and vassal. This circular fellowship represents more than poetic fancy. It addresses fundamental tensions within feudal society that threaten to tear apart the very courts where such stories find their most appreciative audiences. Medieval nobility struggles constantly with questions of precedence, honor, and legitimate authority. Who sits closest to the king? Which warrior deserves the most dangerous mission? How can competing claims of birth, wealth, and achievement be reconciled within a single court? The circular table offers an elegant solution: a brotherhood where worth matters more than wealth, where virtue trumps blood, where merit alone determines standing. Wace's innovation arrives at precisely the moment when European courts are discovering new possibilities for aristocratic behavior. The rough warriors who followed William across the Channel are giving way to their grandsons, men educated in Latin letters, trained in courtly manners, and exposed to sophisticated ideas about honor, love, and spiritual refinement. These new champions require new models of behavior, new stories that reflect their evolving understanding of what nobility might mean beyond mere skill at arms. The transformation continues as the tale crosses linguistic boundaries into Middle English through Lyman's Brut, composed around 1200 for audiences who speak the language of the conquered rather than the conquerors. The English priest brings to the story a different sensibility, one that emphasizes the mystical and supernatural elements while grounding them in landscapes that his readers recognize as their own. Under his pen, the circular board becomes more than courtly furniture. It transforms into a sacred space where divine will manifests through human fellowship. Layman's version reveals how Arthurian material adapts to different cultural contexts while maintaining its essential appeal. Where Norman audiences appreciate sophisticated questions of courtly protocol, English readers respond to themes of justice, protection of the weak, and resistance to tyranny. The fellowship becomes a symbol of hope for common people who dream of leaders who will defend them against oppression, whether from foreign invaders, corrupt officials, or predatory nobles. These early adaptations establish patterns that will govern centuries of Arthurian literature. Each generation discovers in the legend elements that speak to their particular concerns, fears, and aspirations. The basic story remains constant. A great king establishes a fellowship of warriors dedicated to protecting the innocent and upholding justice. But the details shift to reflect changing social conditions, evolving religious ideas, and new political realities. The court that emerges from these early romances represents a revolutionary vision of what monarchy might achieve when guided by Christian principles and dedicated to serving justice rather than mere self-interest. This is kingship transformed from Germanic war leadership into something approaching divine stewardship, where the ruler's primary obligation lies not in enriching his followers through successful raids, but in creating conditions where virtue can flourish and the weak can find protection. Camelot itself becomes more than a royal residence. It evolves into a symbol of perfect governance, made manifest in stone and timber. The castle rises from green meadows beside a flowing river, its white towers catching sunlight like earthly glimpses of the New Jerusalem. Massive walls enclose courtyards, where tournaments test martial skill, while gardens provide spaces for contemplation and courtly conversation. The great hall soars to heights that inspire awe in all who enter, its vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of saints and angels, while banners display the arms of champions from every corner of Christendom. At the hall's center stands the marvel that gives meaning to everything else, the circular table itself, carved from a single enormous oak and polished to mirror smoothness. The wood displays grain patterns that seem to flow like rivers of gold, while inlaid letters of silver mark each seat with the name of the warrior destined to occupy it. 13 empty chairs await heroes not yet born, their blank spaces promising that the fellowship remains open to any champion, worthy of the tremendous honor and responsibility that membership entails. Yet the true glory of this court lies not in its material splendor, but in the quality of fellowship it nurtures. Warriors who have spent their lives competing for glory and precedence discover the joy of brotherhood that transcends individual ambition. Veterans of countless battles find purpose beyond mere victory in causes that serve divine justice. Young champions learn that true honor comes not from defeating enemies, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. This transformation of aristocratic culture reflects broader changes occurring throughout 12th century Europe. The Church's Peace of God movement seeks to limit warfare's destructive effects by protecting non-combatants, while emerging concepts of courtly love introduce new ideals of masculine behavior that emphasize service, courtesy, and spiritual refinement. The Arthurian court becomes a laboratory where these new ideas can be explored and tested, a fictional space where authors can experiment with radical notions of what aristocratic society might become. The circular fellowship establishes codes of conduct that will influence actual behavior among the warrior class for centuries. These rules go far beyond simple martial prowess to encompass complex obligations involving protection of women and children, defense of church property, succor of the poor and helpless, and commitment to truth-telling even when honesty proves dangerous or costly. Such demands require not merely physical courage, but moral strength that transforms warriors into something approaching secular saints. Each new member swears the same sacred oath before taking his place at the table: to fear God and maintain his church, to serve his liege lord in valor and faith, to protect the weak and defenseless, to give succor to widows and orphans, to refrain from wanton offense, to live by honor and for glory, to despise pecuniary reward, to fight for the welfare of all, to obey those placed in authority, to guard the honor of fellow warriors, to eschew unfairness, meanness, and deceit, to keep faith, and at all times to speak truth. These words, spoken in the presence of sacred relics and blessed by priests, create bonds stronger than blood or gold. The champions who gather at this circular board embody different aspects of the chivalric ideal, each representing particular virtues that medieval audiences recognize as essential to Christian warriorhood. Gawain, the king's nephew, exemplifies courtesy and protection of the innocent, his strength waxing and waning with the sun, in tribute to his role as champion of divine light against the forces of darkness. His adventures consistently involve defending those who cannot defend themselves, whether helpless maidens, besieged castles, or kingdoms threatened by supernatural evil. Sir Kay, the foster brother who serves as seneschal, represents the virtue of loyalty that transcends personal advancement. Though often portrayed as rough and sometimes jealous of more glamorous companions, he never wavers in his devotion to the king, who was once the unknown boy he helped raise. His character reminds audiences that true nobility sometimes lies in unglamorous service, rather than spectacular adventure, that someone must handle the mundane tasks that enable others to pursue glory. Bedivere, the one-handed warrior who serves as the king's marshal, embodies absolute fidelity that persists even unto death. His physical disability paradoxically emphasizes his spiritual wholeness, suggesting that true strength comes from commitment to ideals, rather than merely bodily perfection. In later versions, he will be the last companion standing beside his dying lord, trusted above all others to perform the final ritual that returns Excalibur to the mystic waters from which it came. Yvain, the Knight of the Lion, represents the harmony possible between civilization and nature, when both are guided by divine will. His adventures typically involve restoring balance to situations where human pride or folly has disrupted the natural order. Whether through his defense of a magical fountain, his rescue of a noble beast, or his protection of ladies whose inheritance has been stolen by false claimants. His lion companion symbolizes the way divine grace can transform even wild nature into an ally of justice. These early champions establish archetypes that will resonate through centuries of romance literature. Each embodies particular aspects of the chivalric ideal, while remaining human enough to struggle with temptation, failure, and the complex moral choices that real life presents. Their adventures serve as moral instruction for audiences learning to navigate the increasingly sophisticated social world of high medieval Europe. The institution of quests emerges naturally from this emphasis on virtue proved through action. Unlike the conquests of earlier military leaders, these expeditions serve moral rather than political purposes. Warriors venture forth not to seize territory or capture treasure, but to right wrongs, rescue the innocent, and demonstrate the values that their fellowship represents. Each adventure becomes a test of character that reveals the quester's true nature while providing opportunities for spiritual growth and moral development. Quest narratives follow established patterns that reflect medieval understanding of spiritual progress. The hero receives a call to adventure that tests his commitment to chivalric ideals. He encounters obstacles that challenge his courage, wisdom, and virtue. He meets helpers who provide guidance and assistance, often in supernatural forms that suggest divine providence. He faces a climactic trial that requires him to choose between competing goods or to sacrifice personal desires for higher purposes. Finally, he returns to court transformed by his experiences, bearing gifts that benefit the entire fellowship. Tournament culture, flourishing throughout 12th century Europe, provides a real-world context for the fictional ideals expressed in Arthurian romance. These elaborate martial competitions offer warriors opportunities to display prowess in relatively safe environments while practicing the courtly behaviors that romance literature celebrates. The tournament ground becomes a testing space where life imitates art, where actual champions attempt to embody the virtues they admire in literary heroes. The connection between tournament culture and Arthurian ideals proves mutually reinforcing. Real warriors, inspired by tales of circular fellowship, strive to display courtesy, generosity, and protection of the weak during actual competitions. Romance writers, observing tournament behavior, incorporate realistic details of combat and courtly protocol into their fictional narratives. The boundary between literature and life blurs as each influences the other. This interplay between fiction and reality reaches its fullest expression in the concept of chivalric orders that emerge throughout later medieval Europe. The Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and other military religious orders consciously model themselves on literary ideals of Christian warriorhood, creating real institutions dedicated to protecting pilgrims, defending holy sites, and serving the Church's interests. Secular chivalric orders, like the Order of the Garter, explicitly invoke Arthurian symbolism in their ceremonies and ideals. The circular table's revolutionary concept of equality among warriors reflects broader social changes occurring throughout medieval Europe. The rise of universities creates new forms of learning that challenge traditional hierarchies based purely on birth or military prowess. Urban growth produces merchant classes whose wealth rivals that of landed nobility. Monastic reform movements emphasize spiritual merit over worldly status. The Arthurian court provides a fictional framework for exploring how these changing social realities might be integrated into existing aristocratic structures. Yet even as the circular board represents democratic ideals that seem to prefigure modern concepts of equality, it remains firmly grounded in medieval assumptions about hierarchy and divine authority. The table eliminates precedence among companions, but the king who presides over it rules by divine right. Fellowship flourishes among equals, but that equality exists only within a carefully defined group of Christian warriors who have proven their worth through martial and moral excellence. The revolution remains limited, even in imagination. The tension between democratic fellowship and monarchical authority creates dramatic possibilities that romance writers will explore for centuries. How does a king maintain authority over warriors who consider themselves his equals? What happens when the fellowship's collective wisdom conflicts with royal judgment? Can brotherhood survive the strains imposed by competing loyalties, conflicting duties, and human jealousy? These questions drive narratives that explore the practical difficulties of implementing even fictional ideals. Merlin's role evolves significantly in these courtly adaptations, where earlier chronicles portrayed him primarily as a prophet and magical advisor. Romance literature transforms him into something approaching a philosopher king who guides the realm through wisdom rather than supernatural power. His counsel shapes not merely military strategy, but the moral and spiritual development of the champions who will inherit responsibility for protecting the realm when his guidance is no longer available. The wizard's gradual withdrawal from active involvement in court affairs creates space for human agency to assert itself. As his magical protection diminishes, the warriors must rely increasingly on their own judgment, courage, and commitment to the ideals he has helped establish. This transition from supernatural guidance to human responsibility mirrors the broader movement of medieval culture toward greater emphasis on individual moral choice and personal accountability. Religious elements become more prominent in these versions as authors explore the relationship between chivalric virtue and Christian salvation. The circular fellowship serves not merely earthly justice, but eternal purposes, with each warrior's adventures contributing to a cosmic struggle between good and evil that will ultimately determine the fate of human souls. Quests become spiritual pilgrimages, where external adventures reflect internal moral development. The concept of courtly love, developing simultaneously with Arthurian romance, introduces new complexities into the straightforward masculine world of earlier military literature. Warriors must now navigate not only the challenges of combat and quest, but also the subtle protocols of aristocratic romance, learning to serve ladies with the same devotion they show to their king and the same courage they display in battle. This development sets the stage for the tragic complications that will eventually destroy the fellowship's perfect unity. The court that emerges from these early romances represents humanity's highest aspirations made manifest in earthly form. It embodies justice without oppression, strength without brutality, fellowship without faction, and leadership without tyranny. Such perfection cannot last. Medieval audiences understand that all earthly institutions contain the seeds of their own destruction. But for a brief moment, literature allows them to glimpse what human society might achieve when guided by divine grace and committed to serving justice rather than mere self-interest. As these tales spread throughout Europe, they carry with them revolutionary ideas about kingship, nobility, and social organization that will influence actual political development for centuries. Real kings will strive to embody Arthurian virtues. Actual warriors will model their behavior on the legendary heroes, and political theorists will invoke the Camelot court as an example of what monarchy might achieve when properly exercised. The fictional kingdom becomes a powerful force for social change, inspiring reforms that bring reality closer to literary ideals. The Golden Age reaches its zenith in these moments of perfect fellowship, when the circular table gleams in torchlight and the greatest champions in Christendom pledge their lives to ideals that transform mere ambition into sacred purpose. The king looks upon his assembled company with satisfaction that mingles joy with foreboding, understanding that he has achieved something unprecedented in human history, while recognizing the fragility of institutions that depend entirely on the continued virtue of fallible mortals. In the shadows beyond the great hall's blazing hearths, darker possibilities already stir. The very perfection of the fellowship creates expectations that no earthly institution can indefinitely meet. The Brotherhood's success attracts warriors whose motives may be less pure than those of the founding generation. The court's reputation draws ladies whose beauty may prove more dangerous than any dragon, and whose love may demand choices that tear apart the bonds of sacred oath and feudal loyalty. The circular board stands complete at last, its 13 siege perilous still awaiting the perfect champion, whose coming will mark both the Fellowship's greatest triumph and the beginning of its tragic decline. Around its polished circumference, the greatest warriors who ever lived prepare for adventures that will test the limits of human virtue, while proving that even the noblest ideals must ultimately reckon with the weight of mortal sin. The Golden Age has begun, but already the forces that will destroy it gather strength in the hearts of those who love honor more than life, and life more than honor. Camelot rises in its full glory, a beacon of hope that illuminates a dark world, while casting shadows that contain the seeds of its own eclipse. The Round Table Fellowship stands ready to face whatever challenges await, united by bonds stronger than steel, yet more fragile than morning dew, destined for greatness that will inspire legends while pursuing perfection that mortal flesh cannot sustain. The rise is complete. The fall becomes inevitable. In the elegant salon of Champagne, around 1177, Chrétien de Troyes takes up his pen to write what will become the most dangerous story in European literature. Commissioned by Marie, Countess of Champagne and daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the French poet creates a tale that will transform the perfect fellowship of the Round Table into a tragedy of human desire triumphant over divine law. The story he tells introduces a figure who embodies everything the chivalric ideal promises, and everything it cannot survive. The greatest champion who ever lived enters the Arthurian world, like a comet blazing across a clear sky, beautiful and destructive in equal measure. This supreme warrior becomes also the instrument through which the greatest kingdom ever imagined destroys itself, proving that even perfection contains the seeds of its own dissolution, when human hearts dare to feel beyond the boundaries that duty and honor prescribe. The world into which this revolutionary tale emerges has already been transformed by new ideas about romantic devotion, honor, and the proper relationship between men and women of noble birth. Eleanor of Aquitaine's salons in Poitiers and her daughter Marie's gatherings in Troyes have become laboratories for exploring radical concepts of emotional attachment that challenge fundamental assumptions about marriage, loyalty, and spiritual devotion. Troubadour poetry celebrates adulterous affection as the highest form of human experience, while sophisticated aristocratic ladies debate whether true feeling can exist within the bonds of arranged marriage. This cultural revolution provides the context for Chrétien's masterpiece of moral complexity. His Le Chevalier de la Charrette introduces not merely a new character, but an entirely new way of understanding the relationship between earthly attachment and spiritual salvation. Where earlier romance portrayed women as rewards for heroic achievement or symbols of divine grace, Marie's commission demands a story where human desire becomes both the source of the greatest virtue and the cause of the most terrible destruction. The narrative begins with the lake-born champion already established as the finest warrior in the world, but his origins remain shrouded in mystery that later writers will elaborate into one of the most haunting creation myths in medieval literature. Raised by the Lady of the Lake in an underwater realm where time moves differently and earthly laws hold no sway, he emerges into the mortal world equipped with supernatural skills but lacking the spiritual immunity that divine upbringing might have provided. His perfection as a combatant makes him vulnerable to the one force that can destroy perfect fellowship: perfect devotion. The royal consort embodies the impossible position of women in medieval aristocratic society. Married for political alliance rather than personal choice, crowned for her bloodline rather than her individual worth, she finds herself trapped between the roles of sacred sovereign and mortal woman. The bride of the perfect monarch discovers that flawless virtue in a husband can be as isolating as tyranny, that being wed to a living legend leaves little room for the expression of individual longing or personal will. When the greatest warrior in the world encounters the most beautiful woman in the realm, the collision proves catastrophic for everyone involved. Their first meeting, described by Chrétien with exquisite restraint, crackles with unspoken recognition that both transcends and threatens every bond that holds civilization together. Here is attraction at first sight, transformed into a force as destructive as any dragon, as irresistible as any magical compulsion, and as inevitable as the sunset that ends each perfect day at Camelot. The Lady of the Lake's supernatural education has prepared her ward for every challenge except this one. He can defeat any enemy in single combat, but he cannot conquer his own heart. He can resist the temptations of pride, greed, and worldly ambition, but he proves helpless before beauty that seems to incarnate everything noble and pure about the civilization he has sworn to protect. The royal bride becomes his religion, her service his salvation, her affection his damnation. The king's wife faces equally impossible choices. As the sovereign's spouse, she owes absolute loyalty to the monarch who trusts her completely, and the kingdom that reveres her as the embodiment of regal virtue. As a woman, she discovers in the supreme champion the first man who sees her as an individual rather than a symbol, who cherishes her for herself rather than for her crown, who offers the devoted attention that her marriage has never contained. The choice between duty and desire becomes a choice between two forms of betrayal: betrayal of her wedding vows or betrayal of her own heart. The royal assembly that witnesses this developing tragedy remains initially oblivious to the forces gathering at its very center. The sovereign, secure in his own virtue and confident in the loyalty of his greatest champion, cannot imagine that the fellowship he has created might contain within itself the elements of its own destruction. The circular table continues to embody perfect equality among warriors, but that equality becomes meaningless when one warrior's loyalty is divided between his liege and his liege's bride. The other champions begin to sense the tension without understanding its source. Gawain, whose solar strength makes him sensitive to disruptions in natural harmony, notices subtle changes in the patterns of palace life. Kay observes his foster brother's growing unease without connecting it to specific causes. Bedivere, whose absolute loyalty to the king surpasses even the Lake Knight's prowess, begins to watch the greatest warrior with eyes that see too much and understand too little. Marie de France and other sophisticated writers contribute to this literary revolution by creating detailed analyses of the psychological states that refined affection produces. Their layers explore the internal landscapes of those caught between competing loyalties, showing how attraction can elevate the human spirit while simultaneously destroying the social bonds that make civilization possible. These stories provide cultural context for understanding why Chrétien's tale strikes audiences with such devastating force. The cart that gives the French romance its title becomes a symbol of the degradation that devoted service can demand from even the greatest heroes. When a mysterious dwarf offers to reveal the royal consort's location, if the perfect champion will ride in a cart reserved for common criminals, he faces his first impossible choice. Pride counsels him to refuse such humiliation, but emotional bondage compels him to accept any shame that might bring him closer to his lady. His hesitation for barely 2 steps becomes a sin that he will spend the rest of the story attempting to expiate. This episode establishes the moral complexity that will characterize all subsequent developments in their relationship. The knight's devotion to his sovereign's bride transforms him into both the greatest and worst of champions. His desire to serve her perfectly makes him capable of feats that surpass all previous achievements. But his divided loyalty corrupts the very source of his strength. Every victory won in her name becomes a defeat for the fellowship that depends on his absolute devotion to chivalric ideals. The tournament at Noauz reveals the full extent of romantic attachment's power to transform heroic virtue into something approaching madness. When the royal bride commands her champion to do his worst in combat, the greatest warrior in the world becomes a figure of ridicule, allowing inferior opponents to defeat him simply because his lady wishes it. When she reverses her command, he destroys all opposition with supernatural ease. The crowd watches in amazement as the finest champion they have ever seen proves that his prowess serves not honor or justice, but the will of a woman whose smallest gesture commands more authority over him than any royal decree. This demonstration of absolute service to refined affection both fulfills and violates everything that chivalric culture claims to value. The lake-born warrior embodies perfect devotion to his lady, proving that his attachment transcends mere physical desire to become a form of spiritual worship. Yet his willingness to subordinate all other loyalties to her service reveals the dangerous potential for such devotion to undermine the very foundations of feudal society. If the greatest warriors owe ultimate allegiance to ladies rather than lords, how can any kingdom maintain the unity necessary for survival? The royal consort herself becomes increasingly trapped by the impossible position that her champion's devotion creates. His perfect service makes her both the most powerful and most powerless woman in the realm. She can command the greatest warrior with a glance, yet she cannot command the freedom to respond to him openly without destroying everything that gives their bond meaning. The crown that makes her worthy of such devotion also ensures that accepting it fully would bring ruin to everyone she holds dear. The sovereign's position becomes equally untenable as rumors begin to circulate through the palace. His greatness as a ruler depends partly on his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his followers. Yet he cannot demand such loyalty without destroying the trust that makes it meaningful. Suspicion would poison the fellowship that has been his greatest achievement, but willful blindness makes him appear weak or foolish to those who expect royal vigilance in protecting royal honor. The brotherhood begins to fracture along lines invisible to casual observation, but devastating in their cumulative effect. Warriors who once competed only for glory in service of shared ideals now find themselves choosing sides in a conflict that none dare acknowledge openly. Some remain loyal to the king out of feudal obligation or personal affection. Others transfer their primary allegiance to the Lake Knight, recognizing him as the finest flower of chivalric achievement, regardless of his personal failings. Gawain embodies the painful divisions that begin to split the assembly. His loyalty to the sovereign as nephew and sworn companion conflicts with his admiration for the supreme champion as the embodiment of everything chivalric culture promises to achieve. His solar nature, which waxes and wanes with the sun's strength, becomes a metaphor for the way the entire fellowship experiences periods of harmony and discord, depending on the emotional weather generated by the triangle at its center. Gareth and Gaheris, Gawain's younger brothers, represent the confusion of the younger generation, who entered the fellowship expecting to find clear moral guidance, but instead discover that their greatest heroes are trapped in impossible moral positions. Their innocence makes them particularly vulnerable to the disillusionment that spreads through the assembly. as the perfect champions prove themselves capable of imperfection. The concept of fin amours, fine or perfect attachment, that dominates sophisticated literature, attempts to resolve these contradictions by elevating romantic feeling to a spiritual plane, where earthly concerns about marriage, loyalty, and social stability become irrelevant. According to this ideology, true devotion ennobles both participants, transforming them into superior beings whose bond transcends conventional morality. Critics argue that such attachment represents the highest achievement of human civilization, while opponents contend that it threatens the very foundations upon which civilization rests. Chrétien explores these competing interpretations through narrative techniques that refuse to provide simple moral judgments. His protagonist embodies both the glory and the tragedy of refined affection, achieving feats of heroism that surpass all previous champions while simultaneously betraying the fellowship that has made such achievements possible. The French poet forces his audience to wrestle with the same impossible choices that torment his characters, asking whether devotion that produces such magnificent courage can truly be condemned even when it destroys everything it touches. The influence of troubadour poetry on these developments cannot be overstated. Poets like Bernard de Ventadorn and Geoffrey Rudel created a sophisticated vocabulary for describing the psychological states that intense attachment produces, showing how longing can simultaneously elevate and torment the human spirit. Their songs provide the cultural background against which aristocratic audiences understand the lake knight's impossible position, recognizing in his suffering the same noble agony that their own poets celebrate. Eleanor of Aquitaine's personal history adds political urgency to these literary explorations. Her marriage to Louis VII of France was annulled partly due to her failure to produce a male heir, while her subsequent marriage to Henry II of England created political tensions that still shape European diplomacy. Her patronage of literature that questions traditional assumptions about marriage and loyalty reflects her own experience of the costs that dynastic politics impose on individual happiness. The royal salon becomes a center for developing new models of feminine behavior that challenge traditional assumptions about women's roles in aristocratic society. Ladies who once served primarily as symbols of their family's honor, or as rewards for masculine achievement, begin to emerge as independent agents, capable of making choices that shape their own destinies. This development creates space for characters like the royal consort to function as more than passive objects of masculine desire. Yet even these revolutionary changes remain constrained by fundamental medieval assumptions about hierarchy, divine authority, and social stability. The bond between the lake knight and the king's bride may transcend conventional morality in its intensity and purity, but it cannot escape the political and spiritual consequences that adultery brings to kingdoms founded on Christian principles and feudal loyalties. Their attachment may be perfect, but the world in which they must express it remains stubbornly imperfect. The development of confession as a literary device allows writers to explore the internal states of those caught between competing loyalties. Characters can articulate the precise nature of their moral dilemmas, while demonstrating their awareness of the spiritual consequences that their choices entail. This technique transforms romance from simple adventure narrative into sophisticated psychological analysis that reveals the complex motivations driving human behavior. The role of fortune in these stories reflects medieval understanding of the relationship between divine providence and human agency. The devoted may be destined for each other by cosmic forces beyond their control, but they remain responsible for the choices they make in response to those forces. Tragedy results not from external persecution, but from the inevitable conflicts between different forms of loyalty that virtuous people cannot easily resolve. Andreas Capellanus's Art of Courtly Love, written for Marie of Champagne around the same time as Chrétien's romance, provides theoretical justification for the behavioral patterns that these stories explore. His treatise argues that true affection can exist only outside marriage, and that such feeling ennobles participants by teaching them to subordinate selfish desires to the service of something higher than themselves. Critics respond that such theories threaten the foundations of Christian society by legitimizing adultery and undermining parental authority. The Castle of Joyous Guard emerges in later versions as a symbol of the private world that the devoted create outside the constraints of palace society. This fortress, given to the Lake Knight as a reward for his service but transformed into a refuge for forbidden attachment, represents both the possibility of escaping social constraints and the ultimate impossibility of doing so permanently. Even the strongest walls cannot indefinitely exclude the political and spiritual realities that make their bond both transcendent and tragic. The episodes that chronicle the relationship's development reveal Chrétien's genius for creating scenes that operate simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning. Their first kiss, stolen in a garden where roses bloom despite the approaching winter, symbolizes both the natural beauty of their affection and its tragic timing. Their secret meetings in chambers, hung with tapestries depicting famous romantic figures, combine atmospheric beauty with subtle reminders of how such stories typically end. The gradual revelation of their relationship to other members of the assembly creates dramatic tension that drives the narrative toward its inevitable crisis. Agravain, Gawain's brother and the least virtuous member of the fellowship, begins to gather evidence that he can use to destroy the reputation of the champion, whose virtue makes his own vices more apparent by contrast. His malice provides the mechanism through which private sin becomes public scandal, transforming personal tragedy into political catastrophe. The trap that finally exposes the secret relationship demonstrates how even the most careful discretion cannot indefinitely protect those who violate the fundamental assumptions upon which their society rests. When Agravain and 12 companions burst into the royal consort's chamber, where the Lake Knight has come in response to her summons, they find the evidence that makes denial impossible. The greatest warrior in the world, caught weaponless and half-dressed, must fight his way through fellow members of the Brotherhood to escape immediate capture. This scene crystallizes all the contradictions that have been building throughout the narrative. The champion's prowess allows him to defeat armed opponents despite his disadvantage, proving once again that his skill surpasses all rivals. Yet his presence in the royal bride's private chambers at midnight cannot be explained by any honorable purpose, making his guilt apparent regardless of his ability to escape immediate consequences. The fellowship that once united all champions in common purpose now provides opponents in a battle that none should have to fight. The aftermath of this exposure reveals the full extent of the damage that divided loyalty has inflicted on the Brotherhood. Warriors who have fought together against common enemies now choose sides in a conflict that threatens to destroy everything they have built together. The Lake Knight's supporters argue that his service to the realm outweighs any personal failings, while the king's defenders contend that no achievement can excuse betrayal of royal trust and the violation of Christian marriage vows. The royal consort faces the stake for treason and adultery, crimes that medieval law punishes with death, regardless of rank or the complexity of emotional circumstances. The woman who once embodied the feminine virtues that the fellowship existed to protect becomes its prisoner, condemned by the very laws that her position as sovereign's bride was meant to uphold. The circular table that symbolized perfect equality among warriors cannot protect her from the consequences of choices that have placed personal feeling above legal obligation. The champion's rescue of his beloved from execution provides the most dramatic illustration of the conflicts that now consume the assembly. Arriving at the last moment like the hero of a romance, he cuts down the guards and bears the royal consort away to safety, proving once more that his prowess surpasses all opposition. Yet the men he kills include Gareth and Gaheris, unarmed and innocent of any desire to see punishment carried out, whose deaths create blood guilt that no subsequent achievement can wash away. Gawain's transformation from loyal companion to implacable enemy demonstrates how the corruption spreads through the fellowship like poison in a well. The deaths of his beloved younger brothers, killed by accident in the chaos of the rescue, turn the most gracious of the champions into an avenger, whose solar strength becomes focused entirely on destroying the man he once admired above all others. Devotion's attempt to save itself destroys the bonds of brotherhood that made the fellowship possible. The siege of Joyous Gard marks the point where private tragedy becomes public warfare. The sovereign, against his own inclinations, but compelled by the demands of kingship and the pressure of outraged nobles, leads an army against the champion who has served him faithfully for years. The castle that was meant to be a refuge from the world's constraints becomes the center of a conflict that threatens to tear apart the entire kingdom. The division of the Brotherhood into opposing camps reveals how completely the institution has been corrupted by forces it was never designed to handle. Warriors who swore identical oaths and served identical ideals now find themselves on opposite sides of siege lines, each group convinced that their cause serves the higher good. The circular table that once eliminated precedence among equals now stands empty, its perfect form mocking the broken fellowship it was meant to represent. The Pope's intervention, demanding that the royal consort be returned to her husband and that the conflict cease, provides a temporary resolution that satisfies no one completely. The sovereign's bride returns to her royal duties with her reputation forever stained, while the Lake Knight departs for exile in his continental territories, taking with him many of the Brotherhood's finest champions. The Fellowship achieves peace only through division, unity only through permanent separation of the elements that made it great. Yet even this compromise cannot heal the fundamental breach that intense romantic attachment has opened in the heart of the Arthurian world. The kingdom that once represented humanity's highest achievements now bears invisible wounds that will never fully heal. The perfect fellowship has discovered that human perfection remains subject to human limitations, that even the greatest ideals must ultimately reckon with the power of individual desire to override collective responsibility. The bond between the lake-born champion and the royal consort endures, despite the destruction it has caused, proving both the transcendent power of human affection and its tragic inability to exist peacefully within the constraints that civilization requires. Their attachment represents everything that refined culture celebrates about romantic devotion, while demonstrating everything that makes such devotion dangerous to the social order that nurtures it. The greatest warrior in the world rides into exile, carrying the knowledge that his perfection as a champion has been matched by his failure as a faithful vassal. The most beautiful woman in Christendom returns to her throne, bearing the burden of choices that have destroyed the very fellowship she was meant to inspire. The perfect sovereign watches his greatest achievement crumble, understanding that even divine favor cannot protect earthly institutions from the consequences of human frailty. The Brotherhood stands broken, its fellowship shattered by forces that no amount of virtue could resist indefinitely. The devotion that was meant to ennoble has corrupted. The service that was meant to unite has divided. The perfection that was meant to endure has proved as fragile as any mortal dream. In the wreckage of paradise, the survivors prepare for conflicts that will test whether anything meaningful can emerge from the ashes of impossible ideals pursued by imperfect hearts in an imperfect world. The cart rolls on through European literature, carrying its burden of the greatest romantic tale ever told, and the most complete destruction it was possible to achieve through the very excellence that was meant to prevent such catastrophe. In its wake, 1,000 poets will explore the implications of feeling that proves stronger than duty, beauty more compelling than honor, and devotion more dangerous than any dragon that chivalric virtue was ever meant to slay. In the broken aftermath of romantic catastrophe, when the greatest brotherhood in Christendom lies shattered by forces that earthly excellence could not withstand, a new voice emerges to transform personal tragedy into opportunity for redemption. Robert de Boron, writing in the early years of the 13th century, takes up the scattered fragments of Arthurian romance and weaves them into a tapestry that promises healing for wounds that seemed beyond mortal remedy. His innovation will prove more revolutionary than any sword drawn from stone: the introduction of Christ's chalice into a world desperate for grace. The object that de Boron places at the center of his narrative carries the weight of Christian history itself. This is the chalice that caught the blood of Christ as it flowed from his wounds on Calvary, the same vessel that held wine transformed into consecrated essence at the Last Supper, connecting mortal suffering to eternal salvation. Yet the French writer's genius lies not simply in borrowing religious imagery, but in transforming ancient Celtic cauldron traditions into Christian symbolism that speaks to the hunger of his age. Where the Celtic otherworld possessed magical cauldrons that never emptied and could restore the dead to life, de Boron's Christian imagination creates something that nourishes souls rather than bodies, offering eternal rather than temporal sustenance. The transformation reflects the broader cultural shift occurring throughout medieval Europe, as pagan traditions yield to Christian interpretation, while retaining their essential power to inspire wonder and longing. The guardian of this most precious relic dwells in a fortress that exists simultaneously in the physical world and the realm of eternity. Known as the Fisher, this wounded sovereign presides over a wasteland where nothing grows and no rain falls until the proper hero arrives to ask the proper question. His perpetual suffering mirrors the condition of a world wounded by sin, while his eventual healing promises redemption for all who serve the Almighty with pure hearts. This figure draws upon multiple mythological traditions that de Boron synthesizes into a uniquely Christian vision. The Celtic concept of the wounded ruler, whose condition reflects the health of his land, combines with Christian notions of vicarious suffering to create a guardian whose personal agony serves a cosmic purpose. Like Christ himself, this maimed sovereign bears wounds that heal others, endures suffering that brings salvation, and waits in patience for the fulfillment of divine promise. The spear that wounded the fisher carries its own sacred history, identified by Christian tradition as the very weapon that pierced Christ's side as he hung upon the cross. This bleeding lance, perpetually dripping blood that never coagulates, serves as a constant reminder of the price that mercy demands and the wounds that human sin inflicts upon the created order. Its presence in the mystical stronghold establishes the connection between earthly suffering and heavenly redemption. The fortress itself exists outside normal space and time, appearing only to those whose development has prepared them to perceive mysteries beyond mortal comprehension. Some writers describe it as floating upon a lake that reflects not earthly landscapes, but visions of paradise. Others place it upon a mountain so high that its peak touches the lowest sphere of heaven. Still others locate it in a forest where every tree bears fruit, regardless of season, and every flower blooms with supernatural radiance. The approach to this mystical stronghold requires more than physical courage or martial prowess. Warriors accustomed to winning through strength of arm discover that obstacles of the soul demand different weapons entirely. Phantom armies that dissolve at the touch of blessed water test the seeker's faith. Bridges that span bottomless chasms collapse beneath the weight of impure intention. Gatekeepers who appear as fearsome demons reveal themselves as guardian angels to those who refuse to yield to despair. The interior of the fortress surpasses earthly imagination in its beauty and significance. Walls built from precious stones that shine with their own light, enclosed chambers where angelic music provides constant worship, tapestries woven from threads of gold depict scenes from salvation history, while windows of crystal admit light that comes not from sun or moon, but from the presence of the Almighty itself. At the stronghold's heart lies the hall where the chalice appears to those worthy of its manifestation. The procession that brings the precious object into the presence of seeking knights represents the highest achievement of medieval ceremonial imagination. First comes a youth bearing the bleeding lance, its point dripping blood that falls into a silver basin without ever filling it. Next appears a maiden carrying candles that burn with flame, that gives light but produces no heat. Finally enters she who bears the chalice itself, a figure of such surpassing beauty and holiness that mortal eyes can barely sustain her radiance. The relic itself appears differently to each observer according to their condition and destiny. To some, it manifests as a simple wooden bowl, rough-hewn and stained with use, emphasizing the humble circumstances of Christ's earthly ministry. Others perceive it as a chalice of pure gold, adorned with precious stones that represent the glory of paradise. Still others see it as crystal or silver that seems to contain not wine, but liquid light that nourishes souls rather than bodies. The question that must be asked to heal the wounded fisher and restore fertility to the wasteland represents the central mystery of the entire tradition. Different versions propose different wordings. Whom does this serve? Or, what ails thee, uncle? Or simply, what does this mean? But all agree that the seeker must demonstrate genuine concern for another's suffering, rather than mere curiosity about mysterious phenomena. Wisdom reveals itself through compassion rather than intellectual understanding. The failure to ask this crucial question illustrates the tragic gap between worldly achievement and insight that characterizes much of Arthurian romance. The greatest knights in the world prove themselves inadequate to the ultimate test, not because they lack courage or skill, but because their very excellence in worldly affairs has left them unprepared for encounters that demand virtues beyond the martial. Gawain represents the first category of failed seekers, those whose solar strength and worldly success actually hinder their progress toward enlightenment. His power waxes and wanes with the sun precisely because he remains bound to natural rather than supernatural forces. At the mystical stronghold, he perceives the procession, but fails to understand its significance, treating it as a curious spectacle rather than a revelation requiring active response. The nephew's failure demonstrates how even the most virtuous representatives of chivalric culture fall short of the transformation that the ultimate endeavor demands. His courtesy, generosity, and protection of the innocent mark him as an exemplary worldly hero. Yet these very qualities become limitations when confronted with mysteries that transcend earthly categories. The perfect secular knight proves imperfect as a seeker of higher truths. Lancelot's encounter with the precious relic reveals the complex relationship between earthly excellence and grace that drives much of the literature. His unmatched prowess and unwavering dedication to service mark him as the finest flower of chivalric achievement. Yet his divided loyalty and compromised nature prevent him from achieving the purity that the ultimate challenge requires. In some versions, the lake-born knight comes tantalizingly close to success, witnessing the procession and feeling his heart lifted toward contemplation, before memories of his earthly attachments draw him back to mortal concerns. His failure proves particularly poignant because it results not from lack of excellence, but from the very intensity of his commitment to earthly bonds that prevents complete surrender to higher purposes. The third type of failed seeker appears in figures like Percival, whose simplicity and innocence initially seem to promise success, but who ultimately falls short through failure to persevere when faced with supernatural trials. His near achievement serves both to emphasize the difficulty of the endeavor and to prepare audiences for the perfect fulfillment that only absolute purity can accomplish. Percival's Welsh origins connect the tradition to earlier Celtic narratives about heroes who journey to otherworld realms seeking magical objects that restore life and fertility. Yet the Christianization of these materials transforms the simple retrieval mission into a complex pilgrimage that tests every aspect of the hero's moral and religious development. The fool's progress toward wisdom illustrates medieval understanding of how grace operates through human weakness rather than strength. Percival's initial ignorance of courtly protocols and social conventions becomes an advantage in contexts where worldly sophistication proves more hindrance than help. His capacity for wonder and his willingness to ask simple questions reveal truths that more sophisticated seekers miss entirely. Yet even this innocent achieves only partial success, suggesting that something beyond mere purity of heart is required for complete fulfillment of the endeavor. The tradition demands not just freedom from sin, but positive perfection, not just good intention, but flawless execution, not just human excellence, but something approaching the nature of the Almighty itself. The introduction of Galahad into the tradition provides the perfect synthesis of earthly prowess and grace that the challenge requires. Born of Lancelot's union with Elaine, he inherits his father's unmatched martial skills, while remaining free from the compromises that prevent paternal success. His very conception results from a deception that parallels Arthur's begetting, suggesting that providence works through human complexity to achieve purposes that pure human will cannot accomplish. The siege perilous that awaits Galahad's arrival at the Round Table represents the ultimate fusion of worldly and otherworldly symbolism. This seat, deadly to any unworthy occupant, has remained empty since the Brotherhood's foundation, its inscription promising that only the perfect knight can claim it safely. When the young hero takes his place without harm, the assembly recognizes that their long preparation for the ultimate challenge has reached completion. The appearance of the precious relic in the great hall of Camelot itself marks the beginning of the end for the secular brotherhood, manifesting to all present but allowing none to perceive it fully. The object offers a tantalizing glimpse of fulfillment that makes all earthly achievements seem pale and incomplete. The knights who have devoted their lives to worldly service suddenly understand that their greatest adventures have been mere preparation for this ultimate test. The mass departure of the Round Table in pursuit of the sacred object represents both the nobility and the tragedy of higher aspiration. These knights, trained for earthly combat and conditioned for worldly success, abandon everything familiar to seek something that most cannot even properly comprehend. Their willingness to sacrifice certain achievement for uncertain salvation demonstrates the power of calling to transform human priorities. Arthur's sorrow at this dispersal of his carefully gathered assembly reflects the fundamental tension between earthly and otherworldly loyalties that drives the entire tradition. As sovereign, he needs these knights to maintain order and defend the realm against external threats. As Christian ruler, he cannot oppose endeavors that serve higher purposes. His position becomes impossible as different imperatives conflict with political necessities. The individual adventures that unfold during the years of seeking reveal the variety of challenges that confront seekers at different stages of development. Some encounter temptations designed to test their commitment to chastity, poverty, and obedience. Others face obstacles that require them to choose between competing goods or to sacrifice personal desires for higher purposes. Still others must endure periods of apparent failure and abandonment that test their perseverance when favor seems withdrawn. The geographical scope of these adventures reflects medieval understanding of progress as a journey that encompasses both inner transformation and external pilgrimage. Adventurers travel through landscapes that exist simultaneously in the physical world and the realm of allegory, visiting strongholds that represent different aspects of development, while encountering characters who embody various excellences and failings. The hermits and religious figures who provide guidance during these wanderings represent the contemplative tradition that complements the active chivalric life. These holy men and women have achieved through prayer and penance the insights that the knights seek through adventure and trial. Their counsel helps translate worldly experience into understanding, while providing interpretation for the symbolic events that seekers encounter. The achievement of the perfect knight surpasses even the most optimistic expectations of what human excellence might accomplish. Galahad's success results not from superior effort or more intense dedication, but from the unique combination of inherited prowess and grace that makes him capable of sustaining direct encounter with ultimate mystery. His triumph validates the entire chivalric project, while simultaneously transcending its limitations. The healing of the wounded fisher and the restoration of the wasteland demonstrate the cosmic significance of individual achievement. One person's perfect response to calling reverses the consequences of ancient sin while restoring fertility to a world that had forgotten how to flourish. The connection between personal excellence and universal welfare reflects medieval understanding of how individual souls affect the entire created order. The departure of the precious relic from the world marks both the completion of the endeavor and the beginning of a new phase in human development. Having revealed itself fully to those capable of receiving perfect vision, the object withdraws from earthly perception, leaving behind only memory and longing. This departure suggests that certain forms of grace appear only briefly in human history, offering glimpses of ultimate reality before returning to the realm from which they come. The survivors who return to the depleted assembly carry with them knowledge that transforms their understanding of earthly achievement and possibility. They have witnessed the ultimate success that human aspiration can achieve, while recognizing their own limitations in comparison to perfect excellence. Their experience provides both inspiration and humiliation, showing what is possible while emphasizing how rarely such possibility becomes actual. The round table that receives these returning knights bears little resemblance to the confident brotherhood that departed years earlier. Empty seats remind all present of companions who will never return, whether because they died during the endeavor or because they achieved success that took them beyond earthly concerns. The circular symbol of equality now speaks more of loss than achievement, more of absence than presence. Yet the very depletion of the assembly serves purposes that the participants cannot fully comprehend. By drawing away the most advanced members, the endeavor prepares the way for the final testing, that will determine whether earthly achievement can survive the ultimate challenge of moral failure and political catastrophe. The removal of supernatural protection leaves the remaining knights dependent on purely human resources, just as purely human choices threaten to destroy everything they have built. Arthur surveys his diminished court with emotions that blend pride and sorrow, triumph and foreboding. His greatest achievement in gathering the world's finest knights has led directly to their dispersal in service of purposes higher than earthly glory. The success of the endeavor validates his entire reign, while simultaneously ensuring that its greatest accomplishments cannot be permanently sustained. The chalice withdraws from the world it has briefly illuminated, leaving behind an assembly that has glimpsed perfection while remaining trapped in imperfection. The precious relic returns to the realm of mystery from which it came, carrying with it the perfect knight whose achievement surpasses all earthly categories. In its wake, ordinary mortals must continue their struggles with only memory to guide them and hope to sustain them. The great endeavor reaches completion in departure, finds its fulfillment in withdrawal, achieves its purpose through apparent failure. Those who sought the ultimate treasure discover that its very achievement removes it from their grasp, while those who failed to achieve it must find meaning in the seeking itself. The greatest adventure in human history ends not with possession, but with transformation, not with arrival, but with pilgrimage, not with certainty, but with faith. The wasteland blooms again, but the mystical stronghold disappears into mist. The wounded fisher finds healing, but the perfect knight ascends beyond mortal sight. The ultimate endeavor succeeds completely, while leaving the world essentially unchanged, having offered salvation to those capable of receiving it, while demonstrating that such capacity remains rare beyond measure. In the gathering shadows of approaching twilight, the depleted brotherhood prepares for challenges that will test whether anything of value can survive when protection withdraws, and human excellence must stand alone against the consequences of human failure. In the hollow aftermath of otherworldly achievement, when the greatest treasure in Christendom has withdrawn from mortal sight, and the finest warriors have either perished or ascended beyond earthly concerns, the circular brotherhood stands like a broken crown, its empty seats bearing witness to glories that can never be restored. The departure of the pure hero and the sacred chalice has left behind an assembly diminished not merely in numbers, but in purpose, its members struggling to find meaning in earthly service after glimpsing perfection that transcends all worldly achievement. Into this vacuum of authority and purpose steps a figure whose very existence embodies the contradictions that have always threatened to tear the Arthurian world apart. The bastard prince, nephew, or son, depending upon which version of destiny one chooses to believe, emerges from the shadows where he has waited with patient malice for the moment when weakness might be exploited and ancient grievances finally avenged. His time has come at last. The question of this pretender's parentage reveals the evolution of moral complexity within Arthurian literature. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's earliest chronicle, he appears as nephew to the sovereign, a position that makes his eventual betrayal terrible enough, while preserving some measure of innocence for the ruler whose trust he violates. Later writers, seeking to intensify the tragic irony, transform him into something far more damning, the illegitimate offspring of the monarch's unwitting union with his own sister Morgause, a sin committed in ignorance, but destined to destroy everything the circular assembly represents. This transformation from nephew to bastard son reflects medieval understanding of how individual moral failures ripple outward through generations, corrupting institutions and destroying achievements that seemed built upon unshakable foundations. The child conceived in sin becomes the instrument through which sin claims its ultimate price, proving that no earthly paradise can permanently escape the consequences of human frailty. Whether nephew or son, the usurper embodies the principle of internal corruption that proves more dangerous than any external enemy. He has grown up within the heart of Camelot itself, trained in its customs, educated in its ideals, admitted to its innermost counsels. He knows every weakness, understands every vulnerability, can anticipate every response to the challenges he prepares to unleash. The enemy within possesses advantages that no foreign invader could ever enjoy. His resentment builds upon years of perceived slights and deliberate oversights that fester in darkness, while the court celebrates its achievements in blazing light. As bastard or nephew, he remains forever excluded from full inheritance of what he considers rightfully his. As member of the royal family, he must watch others receive the honors and responsibilities that his birth should have guaranteed. As witness to the Brotherhood's gradual corruption through divided loyalties and impossible ideals, he nurtures contempt for values that promise more than they can deliver. The depleted assembly offers him opportunities that would never have existed in the circular Brotherhood's golden prime. With Galahad ascended and the Lake-born's champion exiled, with so many seats standing empty and so many surviving members struggling with disillusionment, the remaining warriors lack the moral authority and unified purpose that once made them invincible. Doubt has replaced certainty, exhaustion has replaced enthusiasm, and cynicism has begun to poison the very ideals that once inspired supernatural achievement. Agravain emerges as the pretender's most valuable ally in the campaign to expose and exploit the court's remaining vulnerabilities. Gawain's brother has always resented the special status accorded to the greatest warrior, despite his own membership in the royal family. And the Lake-born champion's exile has done nothing to heal wounds that jealousy opened years earlier. Where others see tragedy in the assembly's dissolution, Agravain perceives opportunity to settle old scores while advancing his own claims to prominence. The trap that finally destroys what remains of the circular Brotherhood's moral authority demonstrates how personal malice can masquerade as righteous concern for justice and proper order. Agravain's discovery of evidence proving the Queen's guilt provides the excuse that ambitious men need to challenge a sovereign whose authority has always depended more on moral exemplarity than military force. If the monarch cannot govern his own household, how can he claim the right to rule a kingdom? The revelation of royal adultery, whether proven through carefully gathered evidence or manufactured through deliberate deception, tears apart the last remaining bonds that hold the assembly together. Warriors who survive the loss of their greatest champion and the departure of their purest member cannot survive the destruction of their sovereign's personal honor. Some rally to the monarch's defense out of loyalty or affection, while others transfer their allegiance to challengers who promise to restore the moral authority that scandal has compromised. The royal consort's position becomes impossible regardless of her actual guilt or innocence. Medieval law and custom demand her death for adultery and treason, crimes that her rank as queen makes more rather than less serious. The woman who once embodied the feminine virtues that chivalric culture exists to protect becomes its prisoner, condemned by the very legal structures that her status as royal bride was meant to uphold. The circular table that symbolized perfect equality among warriors cannot save her from consequences that no amount of past virtue can mitigate. The trial that follows reveals how completely political considerations have corrupted what once appeared to be disinterested pursuit of justice. Warriors who judge the sovereign's wife understand that their verdict will determine not merely her fate, but the future of the kingdom itself. A finding of guilt destroys royal authority while validating those who challenge the right to rule. A finding of innocence appears to ignore evidence while protecting corruption for political convenience. Whatever decision they reach will tear the assembly apart. The lake-born champion's return to rescue his beloved from execution provides the most dramatic illustration of how personal loyalty conflicts with legal obligation in ways that no amount of virtue can resolve. The greatest warrior in the world proves his excellence one final time by cutting through guards and bearing away the woman he cherishes. Yet every man he kills in the process dies defending laws that he himself has sworn to uphold. His triumph becomes simultaneously his greatest victory and his most damning defeat. The deaths of Gareth and Gaheris in the chaos of the rescue transform what might have remained a private tragedy into an inexorable cycle of blood vengeance that will consume the entire kingdom. These young warriors, unarmed and innocent of any desire to see the queen burn, fall victim to the violence that accompanies the champion's desperate intervention. Their blood cries out for justice that can only be satisfied through the destruction of the man who spilled it, however accidentally or reluctantly. Gawain's transformation from gracious warrior to implacable avenger demonstrates how grief can corrupt even the noblest hearts when personal loss overwhelms rational judgment. The solar hero, whose strength waxed and waned with natural rhythms, becomes a figure of unnatural obsession, his power focused entirely on destroying the man he once admired above all others. The desire for revenge consumes every other consideration, turning courtesy into hatred and wisdom into mad pursuit of satisfaction that no amount of blood can provide. The siege of Joyous Gard marks the point where private grief becomes public warfare, where personal vengeance requires royal armies, where individual tragedy expands to consume an entire kingdom. The sovereign, caught between his obligations as ruler and his feelings as betrayed husband, leads forces against the champion who served him faithfully for years. The castle that was meant to provide refuge from the world's constraints becomes the center of a conflict that threatens to tear apart everything the circular assembly ever achieved. The division of the remaining brotherhood into opposing camps reveals how completely the institution has lost its unifying power. Warriors who swore identical oaths and served identical ideals now find themselves on opposite sides of siege lines, each faction convinced that honor demands they fight former brothers in arms. The circular table that once eliminated questions of precedence becomes meaningless when the assembly itself splits into irreconcilable factions. The Pope's intervention provides temporary respite by demanding that the royal consort return to her husband while the lake-born champion departs for his continental domains. But this diplomatic solution satisfies no one and resolves nothing. The queen resumes her royal duties with her reputation forever stained, while the greatest warrior goes into exile, carrying with him many of the assembly's finest remaining members. Peace comes only through permanent separation of the elements that once made the brotherhood great. Yet even this compromise cannot heal wounds that betrayal and bloodshed have opened in the kingdom's heart. Royal authority, once unquestioned because it rested on moral as well as legal foundations, now depends entirely on force and tradition. The sovereign who once ruled through affection must now govern through fear, a transformation that corrupts both ruler and ruled while preparing the way for challenges that would never have been conceivable in earlier, more confident times. The usurper's opportunity comes when the monarch departs for the continent in pursuit of the exiled champion, leaving the realm in the hands of a nephew whose loyalty has never been tested by the ultimate temptation of absolute power. The royal absence provides the cover necessary for treason, while his pursuit of personal vengeance demonstrates that he has himself abandoned the disinterested pursuit of justice that once legitimized his rule. If the sovereign places private grievance above public duty, why should his subjects remain bound by oaths that he himself has effectively broken? The pretender's seizure of power reveals how thoroughly the circular assembly's dissolution has undermined the kingdom's stability. With the greatest warriors dead, exiled, or departed for otherworldly realms, the remaining nobles lack both the power and the moral authority necessary to resist a challenger who can claim royal blood and point to the monarch's absence as evidence of abdication. The brotherhood that once made the realm invulnerable through unity now leaves it defenseless through division. The bastard's attempt to marry the royal consort represents the ultimate violation of natural order and proper hierarchy. Whether nephew or son, he seeks to claim the woman who represents everything sacred about the kingdom he intends to rule. The proposed union would legitimize his usurpation, while completing the corruption of institutions that once seemed pure beyond any possibility of defilement. That the queen flees rather than submit demonstrates that some principles remain stronger than political expedients, even when resistance appears hopeless. The sovereign's return from the continent brings with it the promise of civil war that will test whether anything meaningful can survive when a kingdom turns its weapons against itself. The ruler who once united Britain through conquest of external enemies now faces the far more terrible task of defeating rebels who know all his strengths and weaknesses, who have learned their warfare in his own service, who can claim legitimacy based on his own failures as monarch and man. The armies that gather for what all participants understand will be the final battle represent more than competing claims to political authority. They embody different visions of what the Arthurian achievement has meant and what its legacy should be. Royal forces fight to preserve what remains of the circular ideal, despite its obvious corruption and failure. The usurper's followers seek to replace compromised institutions with new arrangements that acknowledge reality, rather than pursuing impossible dreams of perfect brotherhood and spotless virtue. The omens that precede the Battle of Camlan warn all participants that this conflict will determine far more than who wears the crown. Strange lights appear in the sky, while unnatural storms ravage the countryside. Holy men receive visions of disaster, while wise women prophesy that the kingdom's greatest glories lie buried beneath approaching catastrophe. The very elements seem to rebel against what is about to unfold on British soil. The royal dream on the night before battle provides the most haunting preview of the destruction that awaits both armies when they meet in combat. The sovereign sees himself seated upon a wheel of fortune that turns inexorably downward, casting him into a pit filled with serpents and venomous beasts. The vision suggests that what appears to be political conflict actually represents cosmic judgment upon achievements that aspired too high and claimed too much for merely human institutions. Gawain's ghost appears in this same dream to warn his uncle against fighting the battle that will destroy both armies while leaving nothing meaningful behind. The solar hero, speaking from beyond death, reveals that he has found peace only by abandoning the thirst for vengeance that corrupted his final years. His counsel offers the monarch one last opportunity to choose mercy over justice, forgiveness over revenge, wisdom over the pride that has already cost the kingdom so much. Yet even this supernatural warning cannot turn aside events that human choices have made inevitable. The sovereign wakes from his dream, understanding what awaits him on the morrow, but finding himself unable to imagine any alternative that would not betray everything he has spent his life defending. The wheel of fortune turns according to laws that no earthly power can suspend, carrying down with it all who have tied their fates to achievements that promised permanence in a world where nothing mortal can endure. The negotiations that precede the battle demonstrate how completely trust has broken down between factions that once shared common cause. Uncle and nephew meet between their armies to discuss terms that neither really expects the other to honor, each searching for advantage while going through motions that custom and hope require. The very fact that such a meeting takes place reveals how far the kingdom has fallen from times when royal word carried absolute authority and family bonds could be trusted to overcome political differences. The drawing of swords that signals the battle's beginning results from a misunderstanding so slight that it seems almost accidental. Yet the violence that follows proves that any excuse would have sufficed to unleash hatred that had been building for years. A warrior draws his blade to kill an adder that threatens his foot, but watching armies interpret the gesture as treachery and launch themselves into combat that will leave both sides destroyed. The symbol seems appropriate. Poison that appears trivial destroys everything it touches. The battle itself transcends ordinary warfare to become something approaching apocalypse. Father fights son, brother battles brother. Warriors who learned their skills in the same training yards now seek to destroy each other with techniques that common teachers provided. The circular assembly's investment in creating the world's finest champions proves to have prepared them perfectly for the task of mutual annihilation. By evening, two armies have become two men, sovereign and usurper, legitimate ruler and bastard pretender, facing each other across a field littered with everything the Arthurian world once held precious. The circular table lies broken, its assembly dissolved in blood. The greatest warriors in Christendom feed ravens that care nothing for the ideals that inspired their sacrifice. The kingdom that promised to last forever has consumed itself in a single day's fighting. The final combat between uncle and nephew reveals the terrible symmetry that has always underlain their relationship. Each represents what the other might have become under different circumstances. Each embodies virtues and flaws that mirror those of his opponent. Royal nobility and bastard resentment, sovereign idealism and pretender cynicism prove to be complementary rather than contradictory forces that have shaped the entire tragedy. The death blow that each delivers to the other suggests that neither can survive what their conflict has revealed about the nature of earthly achievement and human limitation. The monarch drives his spear through the usurper's body, even as the traitor's sword finds its mark beneath royal armor. The simultaneous wounds prove fatal to both, ensuring that victory belongs to neither side, and that the kingdom they have destroyed fighting over will belong to whoever proves strong enough to claim its ruins. The sovereign's last words, spoken as life ebbs from his body, while sunset stains the battlefield red, reveal his final understanding of what the circular achievement has meant and what its destruction has cost. The ruler who once believed that human virtue could create earthly paradise now recognizes that such dreams demand prices that no mortal institution can sustain indefinitely. His legacy lies not in permanent achievement, but in the aspiration itself, not in successful creation of perfect brotherhood, but in the demonstration that such perfection remains worthy of pursuit despite its ultimate impossibility. The survival of Bedivere alone among the circular assembly provides witness to the final act of a drama that began with a sword drawn from stone and now ends with that same blade returned to the waters from which it came. The one-handed warrior whose loyalty never wavered despite every temptation and trial performs the last service that sovereignty can require, ensuring that the symbols of authority do not survive to inspire false hope or enable unworthy successors. The casting of Excalibur into the lake represents the definitive end of the Arthurian age and the beginning of whatever will follow. The sword that chose the sovereign and legitimized his rule recognizes that no one now alive possesses the virtue necessary to wield it worthily. Its return to the Lady of the Lake suggests that supernatural aid will not be available to heal wounds that human choices have inflicted upon the world. The mysterious barge that carries the dying ruler toward Avalon provides the final image of hope and uncertainty that will haunt every subsequent age. His departure leaves his ultimate fate ambiguous, dead or sleeping, gone forever, or awaiting the moment when Britain's need will call him back to life. The promise of return offers comfort to those who mourn the kingdom's destruction, while acknowledging that such comfort may prove illusory. The royal consort's retreat to a nunnery and the lake-born champion's adoption of hermit's robes complete the dissolution of the triangle, whose tensions help destroy the circular assembly. The greatest romantic tale in literature ends not with fulfillment, but with renunciation, not with earthly happiness, but with preparation for whatever judgment awaits souls who chose desire over duty, personal fulfillment over social obligation, human affection over divine commandment. The kingdom that promised to endure forever has lasted barely a generation, its achievements scattered like leaves before autumn winds, its heroes dead or departed, its ideals proven inadequate to the challenges that reality presents to even the noblest aspirations. Yet something remains in the ruins that no amount of destruction can eliminate entirely. The memory of what was attempted, the vision of what might be possible, the hope that future generations will learn from both the successes and failures of the greatest assembly that ever gathered around a table, meant to symbolize human equality under divine authority. Camelot stands empty, its halls echoing with ghostly voices that speak of glories no living ear will hear again. The circular table lies shattered, its perfect form broken into fragments that can never be reassembled. The once and future ruler sleeps in Avalon, waiting for a summons that may never come. The greatest story ever told has reached its end in tragedy that encompasses triumph, in failure that redeems success, in death that promises the possibility of rebirth when the world grows worthy of the return it desperately needs but may never deserve. The veils that enshroud Avalon have never parted, and perhaps they never shall. In that threshold realm between mortality and slumber, between chronicle and mythology, between what occurred and what may yet unfold, the once and future sovereign awaits with wounds that neither mend nor destroy, surrounded by enigmas that no earthly wisdom can fathom. His withdrawal from the mortal realm marks not a conclusion, but a metamorphosis, the instant when flesh becomes eternal emblem, when individual accomplishment transcends its boundaries to become something greater than any single existence could encompass. The vessel that carries the wounded monarch from Camlan's devastation bears with it the final tangible link to an era that promised more than human nature could sustain. Those shadow-cloaked figures who minister to his injuries, sometimes recognized as Morgan Le Fay and her otherworldly sisters, sometimes as celestial beings serving purposes beyond terrestrial understanding, embody the powers that govern the threshold between temporal achievement and everlasting significance. Their care offers neither absolute healing nor certain demise, but something more intricate, the preservation of possibility itself. This ambiguous departure serves purposes that definitive endings could never accomplish. A deceased ruler becomes merely historical, his accomplishments reduced to chronicles that academics debate and politicians cite. A living sovereign demands immediate loyalty or resistance, forcing decisions that divide rather than unite. But a slumbering monarch, neither dead nor alive, becomes something far more potent, a vessel of hope that transcends the failures of any particular moment, while promising redemption that remains perpetually accessible to those worthy of receiving it. The concept of the promised restoration Rex quondam rexque futurus, the ruler who was and who shall be, reflects profound human longing for hope that survives the destruction of everything that once seemed permanent and virtuous. When earthly institutions crumble and mortal leaders prove inadequate to their challenges, the vision of restoration offers solace that transcends rational examination. Perhaps the greatest achievement lies not in what was accomplished during the historical reign, but in what the memory of that reign continues to inspire centuries after its apparent end. Medieval chroniclers grasped this distinction between historical fact and symbolic truth, crafting accounts that serve different purposes than mere factual documentation. The Glastonbury monks, who claimed to uncover the royal tomb in 1191, were not simply perpetrating deception for financial gain, though their discovery certainly brought pilgrims and revenue to their abbey. They were responding to genuine hunger for connection to ideals that seemed increasingly distant from the harsh realities of medieval political existence. The inscription supposedly found on the sepulchre, "Here lies the famous sovereign in the Isle of Avalon," provides exactly the kind of tantalizing evidence that satisfies neither skeptics nor believers completely. Archaeological investigation reveals probable Saxon burials at the site, suggesting that someone important was indeed interred there, but nothing that definitively connects the remains to the mythic ruler. The mystery endures because it serves purposes that resolution would destroy. This pattern of deliberate ambiguity characterizes every aspect of how medieval and later cultures have approached the Round Table material. Rather than seeking to resolve questions about historical accuracy or mythological interpretation, successive generations have found value in preserving the tension between competing explanations. The chronicles work precisely because they resist reduction to simple formulations, whether historical, literary, or spiritual. The political uses of these heroic images reveal how powerfully the symbolism continues to resonate with rulers and subjects alike. Henry VII's claim to Welsh ancestry and his naming of his eldest son after the mythic sovereign represent calculated attempts to link Tudor legitimacy to the most compelling vision of righteous monarchy that medieval culture had produced. The red dragon that became the Welsh national symbol carries explicit connections to prophecies about the restoration of the rightful ruler who will return Britain to its destined greatness. These political appropriations demonstrate both the enduring appeal of the Round Table vision and its dangerous susceptibility to manipulation by those who understand the power of symbols to shape popular consciousness. Every major British political movement has found ways to invoke the circular table ideal or the promise of restoration, usually in service of causes that bear little resemblance to the spiritual and moral concerns that drove the original narratives. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII inadvertently contributed to the chronicle's continued evolution by removing institutional control over how the tales could be told and interpreted. Without official church oversight, popular accounts flourished in forms that emphasized romantic and adventurous elements, while downplaying the explicitly religious themes that had dominated medieval versions. This secularization prepared the way for later transformations that would make the material accessible to audiences with very different cultural assumptions. Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, completed during his imprisonment in the 1460s and printed by William Caxton in 1485, represents the culmination of medieval Round Table heritage and the beginning of its modern transformation. Writing in an England torn by civil war, Malory found in the chronicles both an explanation for contemporary chaos and a vision of what might be possible if honor, loyalty, and justice could triumph over faction and self-interest. The Night Prisoner's synthesis draws together materials from Geoffrey of Monmouth, Chrétien de Troyes, the Vulgate cycle, and dozens of other sources to create a unified narrative that has influenced every subsequent interpretation of the material. His prose style, elegant yet accessible, established the tone that most readers still associate with Round Table literature: noble without being pompous, archaic without being incomprehensible, romantic without sacrificing awareness of tragedy. Malory's interpretation emphasizes themes that spoke directly to his own historical moment, while establishing patterns that would resonate with later ages. The breakdown of feudal loyalty, the corruption of idealistic institutions, the tragic consequences of private passion for public order. All these concerns reflected 15th century anxieties, while addressing universal human experiences that transcend any particular historical period. The printing press ensured that Malory's version would reach audiences far beyond the aristocratic circles that had previously controlled access to Round Table material. Caxton's edition, with its pragmatic prose and moral earnestness, brought the chronicles into the emerging world of middle-class literacy and Protestant piety. The tales that had once served to educate nobles in the complex responsibilities of leadership now began to shape broader cultural understanding of heroism, romance, and moral obligation. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods saw declining interest in medieval material that seemed to represent everything that rational, progressive culture was leaving behind. The age that produced Shakespeare and Newton had little patience for narratives of miraculous swords and supernatural chalices, preferring classical models of heroism and achievement that emphasized human agency rather than divine intervention. For nearly 3 centuries, the Round Table material seemed destined for the antiquarian obscurity that claimed so many other medieval chronicles. The Celtic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries rescued the tales from neglect by connecting them to emerging movements of romantic nationalism and cultural preservation. Scholars like Thomas Percy and Joseph Ritson began collecting and publishing medieval texts that revealed the richness of native British literary heritage, while poets like Thomas Gray found inspiration in the mysterious beauty of ancient narratives that classical education had taught them to ignore. James Macpherson's controversial Ossian poems, whether authentic ancient material or 18th century fabrication, demonstrated the hunger that contemporary audiences felt for connection to their pre-modern heritage. The wild landscapes and heroic passions that Macpherson described or invented created cultural space for renewed appreciation of similar elements in genuinely medieval material. The Gothic revival in architecture and literature provided additional context for renewed interest in Round Table themes. As neo-Gothic churches and houses rose throughout Britain, and as novelists like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe explored the psychological appeal of medieval settings, the chronicles began to seem less like quaint antiquarianism and more like access to emotional and spiritual truths that classical restraint had obscured. Alfred Tennyson's Idylls of the King, published between 1859 and 1885, represents the most influential modern interpretation of Round Table material and the most successful integration of medieval romance with contemporary moral concerns. The Poet Laureate's cycle of narrative poems transforms Malory's material into a sustained meditation on the challenges facing Victorian society. The proper relationship between individual desire and social obligation, the role of spiritual values in an increasingly secular age, the possibility of maintaining moral idealism in the face of scientific materialism. Tennyson's achievement lies not in simple modernization of medieval tales, but in demonstrating their continued relevance to questions that every generation must answer for itself. His portrayal of the sovereign as a figure struggling to maintain Christian virtue in a world that seems increasingly hostile to such ideals, spoke directly to Victorian anxieties about the survival of established values in an age of rapid social change. The poet's treatment of the relationship between individual psychology and social order reflects contemporary interest in the emerging sciences of sociology and psychology, while remaining grounded in moral philosophy that medieval audiences would have recognized. His characters wrestle with internal conflicts that reveal universal human nature while confronting external challenges that reflect specifically modern conditions. The Idylls also demonstrate the continued power of Round Table symbolism to address political concerns without descending into partisan polemic. Tennyson's vision of the ideal society built on the circular table principle offered readers a standard by which to judge contemporary institutions, while avoiding the accusation that he was promoting any particular political program. The poetry works as social criticism precisely because it operates at the level of symbol rather than policy. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw an explosion of round table material that reflected both scholarly advances in medieval studies and popular appetite for romantic escape from increasingly complex modern life. Writers like William Morris, Algernon Charles Swinburne, and Matthew Arnold found in the Chronicles resources for exploring themes of love, loss, and spiritual seeking that seemed particularly relevant to an age struggling with religious doubt and social fragmentation. The emergence of academic medieval studies provided new scholarly frameworks for understanding the historical development and cultural significance of Round Table literature. Scholars like Jesse Weston and Roger Sherman Loomis traced connections between medieval romances and ancient Celtic mythology while exploring the psychological and anthropological dimensions of the material. Their work established the Chronicles as legitimate subjects for serious academic investigation, while revealing new layers of meaning that previous generations had missed. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Tintagel and Cadbury Castle began to provide tantalizing physical evidence for the possible historical foundations of the narratives. While no definitive proof emerged for the existence of the historical monarch, excavations revealed the kind of post-Roman British culture that could have produced the achievements that later accounts attributed to him. The gap between history and romance began to seem less absolute than it had appeared to purely literary scholars. T.H. White's The Once and Future King, written between 1938 and 1958, represents the most successful modern adaptation of Round Table material and perhaps the most influential interpretation since Malory. White's tetralogy combines profound understanding of medieval sources with distinctly 20th century sensibilities, creating a version that speaks directly to contemporary concerns while remaining faithful to the essential spirit of the established material. White's achievement lies in his ability to find humor, psychological complexity, and political relevance in narratives that had often been treated with ponderous solemnity by Victorian and Edwardian interpreters. His sovereign is neither the remote hero king of medieval romance, nor the morally exemplary figure of Tennyson's poetry, but a recognizably human character whose greatness emerges from his struggle to understand and overcome his own limitations. The tetralogy's treatment of war, power, and moral responsibility reflects the author's experience of 2 world wars, and his understanding of how easily idealistic movements can be corrupted by the very power they seek to exercise for good. White's realm becomes a laboratory for exploring the possibilities and limitations of enlightened government, with results that illuminate both medieval concerns and contemporary political dilemmas. The influence of White's interpretation extends far beyond literature into popular culture through the musical adaptation by Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe, which opened on Broadway in 1960 and became permanently associated with the Kennedy presidency after Jacqueline Kennedy invoked its imagery following her husband's assassination. The connection between the mythic realm and the promise of progressive politics demonstrates the continued power of Round Table symbolism to express hopes for social transformation. Modern cinema has provided new venues for exploring these heroic themes, while adapting them to the visual narrative demands of contemporary audiences. Films ranging from Robert Bresson's austere Lancelot du Lac to John Boorman's mystical Excalibur to Jerry Zucker's romantic First Night reveal the material's continued capacity to support radically different interpretations while maintaining its essential appeal. The development of fantasy literature as a distinct genre has provided new contexts for Round Table material, with writers like Marion Zimmer Bradley, Mary Stewart, and Bernard Cornwell creating versions that emphasize historical realism, feminist perspectives, or mythological dimensions that earlier interpreters had minimized. These approaches demonstrate the chronicle's continued relevance to contemporary concerns, while revealing new aspects of familiar material. The emergence of Celtic studies as an academic discipline has deepened understanding of the pre-Christian heritage that influenced medieval Round Table literature. Scholars like Proinsias McKenna and Miranda Green have traced connections between the mythic realm and ancient Celtic concepts of kingship, otherworld journeys, and the relationship between human society and natural order. Their work has revealed layers of meaning that purely literary analysis had missed. Archaeological investigation continues to provide new evidence about post-Roman Britain that illuminates the historical context from which the chronicles emerged. Discoveries at sites throughout Western Britain reveal a culture sophisticated enough to support the kind of achievements that accounts attribute to the historical sovereign, even if definitive proof of his existence remains elusive. The global spread of Round Table material reflects both the influence of British culture and the universal appeal of the themes that the chronicles explore. Japanese manga, Brazilian novels, and African-American retellings demonstrate the narrative's capacity to transcend their original cultural boundaries, while addressing concerns that different societies face in their own historical moments. Tourism to related sites reveals the continued popular appeal of the chronicles and their power to transform landscapes into repositories of meaning that transcends their immediate physical characteristics. Tintagel, Glastonbury, and dozens of other locations draw visitors seeking connection to ideals that seem increasingly distant from contemporary life. The fact that most of these connections are historically dubious matters less than their capacity to inspire reflection on questions of leadership, community, and moral obligation. The digital age has created new opportunities for engaging with Round Table material through video games, interactive media, and online communities that allow participants to explore the mythic realm in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. These developments suggest that the material's evolution is far from complete, and that new forms of interpretation will continue to emerge as technology creates new possibilities for narrative. Environmental movements have found inspiration in these themes of stewardship, the connection between ruler and land, and the consequences of failing to ask the right questions about the relationship between human activity and natural order. The wasteland that results from the fisher's wound becomes a powerful metaphor for ecological damage, while the promise of healing offers hope for restoration that transcends purely technological solutions. Educational institutions continue to find value in Round Table material as a means of introducing students to complex questions about literature, history, ethics, and cultural development. The chronicles provide accessible entry points for discussing everything from medieval society to narrative structure to the relationship between myth and reality. Their continued presence in curricula at every level suggests that they retain educational value that purely historical or contemporary material cannot provide. The question of why these particular narratives have survived when so many other medieval accounts have been forgotten reveals something fundamental about human nature and social organization. The circular table ideal continues to offer a compelling vision of how competing individual interests might be reconciled within just social arrangements. The tragic failure of that ideal provides equally compelling insight into the limitations that constrain all human institutions, however well-intentioned their founders. The promise of restoration speaks to universal human need for hope that transcends immediate circumstances and apparent defeats. In an age when established sources of meaning and authority seem increasingly fragile, the image of the sleeping sovereign who will awaken when his people need him most provides comfort that neither purely rational analysis nor conventional religious consolation can supply. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the Round Table heritage lies not in any particular version or interpretation, but in its demonstration that narratives can embody truths that transcend the limitations of any single historical moment or cultural context. The chronicles continue to evolve because they address questions that every generation must answer for itself. How should power be exercised? What obligations do the strong owe to the weak? How can individual desires be reconciled with social responsibilities? What price are we willing to pay for our highest ideals? The mists of Avalon continue to swirl around these questions, offering glimpses of answers while preserving the mystery that makes continued seeking both necessary and worthwhile. In that otherworld realm where the wounded sovereign waits for his summons, all possibilities remain open, and all hopes retain their power to inspire. The once and future ruler slumbers not in defeat but in preparation, not as an ending, but as a beginning that each new generation must discover for itself. The greatest narrative ever told remains unfinished, because its truth lies not in what happened long ago, in a land that may never have existed, but in what continues to happen, wherever human beings gather around tables, both literal and metaphorical, to seek justice, fellowship, and meaning that transcends the limitations of their individual lives. The circular table endures not as furniture, but as symbol, not as historical artifact, but as eternal possibility, not as achievement, but as aspiration that calls forth the best that humanity can offer, while acknowledging the frailties that make such offerings both necessary and precarious. The realm exists wherever people dare to believe that the world can be better than it is, that excellence is worth pursuing despite its costs, that the perfect society remains worth seeking, even though all attempts to create it end in failure. The kingdom that promised to last forever endures precisely because it never existed, inspiring each generation to create its own version of what fellowship, justice, and nobility might mean in their particular historical moment. The narrative continues because it must, because human nature demands both the vision of what might be possible and the wisdom that comes from understanding why such visions can never be permanently achieved. In the end, perhaps that is the deepest truth that the Round Table heritage has to offer. Not that perfection is achievable, but that the pursuit of perfection remains the most human of all activities, worthy of our greatest efforts, even though it leads inevitably to tragedy, failure, and the hope of rebirth that makes all chronicles worth telling and retelling through all the ages of the world.